What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast that interviews creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name is Phillip Russell, and I'm with my co-host,
Ben Thorp.
Ben, I'm really excited for this conversation. We got to talk to one of my personally favorite authors, Jamel Brinkley, the author of A Lucky Man, which was a short story collection that came out back in like 2017, I want to say, 2018.
I just pulled it up and it does say it's 2018. Yeah.
2018. He just has a new collection coming out called Witness, which is coming out August 1st. And we got to talk to him about it, read the book early. It was a really, really, really great conversation, I thought.
You know what I was noticing as we were reading this is, boy, it's good to be back at short stories. I forget about them. I think I'm someone who tends to read novels. But anytime I come back to them, I'm like, do you ever think about how short stories like great, actually?
100%. Yeah. And I mean, Jamel is definitely, in my opinion, like one of the current greats, American short story writers. I think the endings, which we get into in the conversation, really hit. But also just like I think especially with this collection compared to his first, just it feels very subdued and subtle and kind of leaves you with a lot to chew on afterwards. So we kind of get into all that in the conversation. But how about before we give everything away, we can just run the conversation and then afterwards we can jump into discussing all the things we learned. Jamel Brinkley is the author of a new short story collection called Witness, and previously published the short story collection A Lucky Man, which was the finalist for the National Book Award, the Story Prize, the John Leonard Prize, the PEN Robert W. Bingham Prize, and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the winner of a PEN Oakland Award and the Ernest J Award for Literary Excellence. His writing has appeared in A Public Space, Ploughshares, The Paris Review, American Short Fiction, Guernica, Glimmer, The Best American Short Stories, and many more. He was raised in Brooklyn and the Bronx and now teaches at Iowa Writers Workshop. Jamel, thanks so much for coming on. We're so excited to talk to you about Witness.
Thanks so much for having me.
So first off, congrats about Witness, which is coming out August 1st, 2023. It's almost here. I'm curious, just like, how are you feeling about it? How does it feel to kind of have this new set of stories in the world?
I think I'm supposed to say that I'm excited and all that kind of stuff. I'm actually terrified. It's terrifying. I find it terrifying. I become very anxious leading up to publication day. In fact, I think I'm even more anxious because I'm at least somewhat of a known quantity now. I'm not just some rando who's publishing a first book, I mean, there's great comfort in being a rando sometimes. So yeah, I think there's always the threat of the sophomore slump. You never know how people are going to react. It just feels like writers are more public than ever, with social media, so in addition to reviews, you can just have any old person saying any old thing. And I don't know, the whole prospect is scary. I'm probably overdoing it in terms of the anxiety, but I'm mostly anxious, and I have found moments of joy, but I'm mostly anxious.
Yeah,
I get that.
We recently had Victor Lavelle on, and he kind of talked about his relationship to like reviews and like reading reviews and like how, I think early on he was saying, early books, I used to like go through and look at every Goodreads review and then just get like really upset about some of the things that I was seeing. And I don't know, what is your relationship to a book coming out? And are you someone who reads everything that's out there? Or are you someone who's like, and now I'm just going to go into my hole and pretend that none of this exists?
Yeah, I think it will evolve. I don't look at Goodreads. I try to avoid it as much as possible. I mean, I've looked at it for other people's books, but I don't want to look at it for my own book because it can just be such a cesspool, I wish I had the sense of humor and the resilience to kind of shrug it off. Like people read their bad reviews and just kind of laugh at them or even post them, you know.
Yeah.
I can't do that. I yeah, I'm too sensitive. In terms of reviews, I think someone told me that earlier in your career, it's probably good to read them, you know,
Hmm.
whether they're raves, positive, mixed, or pans. Just so because you're earlier in your career, hopefully you have a lot of artistic development coming. And it's kind of good to know what people are saying about your work, you know, in
Hmm.
terms of professional reviews. And then maybe later down the line, you can kind of not read them or read them very selectively.
Hmm. I really like
Yeah,
that.
that makes sense. I mean, I obviously you're getting at it already, but to kind of situate maybe my relationship to your work, like I first discovered you right, I think right around the time when A Lucky Man came out, and just a couple months prior to that, I was in a master's program at Ohio University for prose writing, and my teacher for a fiction workshop at the time had just introduced me a couple months prior to Edward P. Jones in class, and it kind of felt like a perfect conversation happening as like a black male writer, kind of trying to think about short stories and everything, and you know, obviously, A Lucky Man kind of blew up and had a lot of success. I'm curious, this like after that kind of wave, when you were starting to work on the next things, like what was the genesis for you with Witness, or did you set out to write another collection? Like, just kind of what did that writerly life look like post A Lucky Man?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, well, I guess it's important to note that, you know, when I wrote the stories that were in A Lucky Man, um, I was in graduate school. I was in my
Hmm.
own MFA program, and most of the stories in that collection were drafted while I was in that program. So I had that institutional home when I wrote those stories, um, which was really helpful in a lot of ways. Um, I guess somewhat similarly, I had an institutional home for a lot of the stories in Witness too. I was at Stanford for 2 years,
Mm.
in the Wallace Stegner program, and I don't know. There's all kinds of discourse about writing programs and can writing be taught, and you know, a lot of critique. Some of it valid, some of it strange to me, but for me, having those institutional homes and writing programs really facilitated the work.
Hmm.
Um, I did want to write another collection. I know that, I don't know, my agent may not have been happy about that, or publishers might not have been happy about that, but I love the short story form, and new stories were coming, you know. Um, Another thing I would say is that, you know, I'm really happy with the way things went with The Lucky Man. Obviously, it's the first book, so you know I think I made some errors in that book that I would hope not to make again. But I think with this book, I was also reacting against the reaction to A Lucky Man, if that
Hmm.
makes
Mm.
sense. Because, and I don't know if this is generally true, but I have a suspicion that a lot of artists, writers specifically, maybe chafe against being kind of labeled or boxed in, you know,
Yeah.
and for reasons because of you know the stories that were in A Lucky Man focusing so much on male characters because the collection came out you know during when Me Too was really a thing that's in the news. Sort of the discourse around the book became this is a book about masculinity, black masculinity, toxic masculinity, some
Hmm.
form of masculinity, right? And of course, I recognized that that was true to some extent, but I also was like, well, I don't want to be the masculinity writer, you know? And so I felt like with this collection, I wanted to spread my wings a little bit, try to do some things I didn't do, focus on different kinds of characters in addition to male characters, and see what happened.
I'm looking for this quote because we wrote out, I think we were both really interested in why you're interested in short stories. I think you're kind of noting that like you're drawn to them over things like a novel. What is it about short stories specifically that you're like, this is a place that I want to keep returning to? And I'm not finding the quote, but I've read an interview with you where you said something to the effect of short stories feel closer to life and memory and how we experience them. Can you kind of expand like what that looks like for you?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say, as far as first, in terms of my love of the short story, to me, that means I think I'll always be writing short stories, you know? It doesn't mean I'll never write a novel or don't want to write a novel, but I don't feel like I've graduated or will ever graduate from short stories, you know? Um, and as far as what appeals to me about them, I think I would say that, like with a novel, like with a traditional novel, we're not talking about experimental novels that can do all kinds of crazy things. But sometimes with a novel, you sort of get a sense of a cohesive life, like you're tracking the long line, of a cohesive life. And of course, there are episodes that are highlighted and things like that. There's always temporal play. Things are emphasized or de-emphasized. But you kind of get this long line, and there's a coherence to the plot of a traditional novel. And for me, my life doesn't feel like that. Like I don't feel like I can track things neatly, in the way that things might track a little more neatly in a novel. Or a better way of putting it is I think that the kind of contained, dense, strange space of a small short story sort of feels more like my life, or like my life feels like a number of those collected, you know?
Mm.
So there's something appealing about trying to capture those moments in your life that feel like they have the stamp of your entire life.
I love that. No, I mean, like something that I've always appreciated in your stories is, you have this attention to how your characters' interior lives and desires kind of bring up tensions in their exterior reality with the other people in their lives. And I think in Witness, you kind of continue that, but there's another layer, to me at least, where expectations, restrictions, and ideas that characters place on others, how we see others and formulate ideas around them, that might not always be true. Like that seems to be another kind of ripple that happens in these stories. And I'm curious if maybe you could talk a little bit about that and kind of bearing witness or perceiving that seems to be so central to a lot of these.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like this is a deeply interpersonal collection. I think the stories are about friend groups or families or romantic relationships or situationships or whatever you want to call them. Um, and I think that's probably, I don't know if by design is the right phrase, but it's certainly what I was thinking about, you know. Um, I think I think as you start to get a little older, you're well out of your teenage years and your very young adulthood. You start to get older and things just start to happen in your life, or in the lives of people around you. So you just see people getting older themselves, maybe needing more care. Um, you see people falling ill.
Mm-hmm.
You start to lose people. People pass away, you know, oftentimes much too soon. And I think, just even in the last few years, it feels like that's starting to
Mm.
accelerate. That thing that we all eventually go through of losing people in our lives. And so I kind of wanted to focus in on, the idea of what are our responsibilities to each other? Like, what does it mean to show care? What does it mean to act um, in the interest of other people? What does it mean to withhold that care? To decide not to act. And even prior to that question is the question of, well, what do you perceive? What do you actually perceive that's happening out there? What do you perceive happening in this other person's life? Do you perceive what you want to perceive, or do you perceive what you need to perceive? They're two very different things. And then the third piece I would throw in there, I think, is just the idea of not witnessing necessarily merely what's external to you, but witnessing the self, right? This idea of your own self-image, and is it accurate? And what does your self-image enable you and prevent you from doing? These are the kinds of questions that I kind of wanted to explore in these stories.
One of the things, and maybe riffing on the idea of like the short story is like truer to life, is that to me a lot of the stories feel in their conclusions kind of understated. Like the big moments for characters are never these massive choices or like life-altering decisions. They're these really subtle shifts in how people see themselves or see a relationship. There's a line in the title story Witness about feeling that we have less control over our lives than we think we do, that I feel like so many of these stories feel like they're kind of grappling with.
Yeah.
Because so many of these people are just like, who am I, and am I really making these choices about who I'm becoming, or are these things just like little things that only after the fact can I look back and be like, oh, that was a decision that I made there. Can you kind of talk about like where you find those nuances? Because I think they're really subtle, but they're all, you're kind of playing with them and pulling them out in each story. And so maybe you can just talk about like how you find those moments to toy with.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is finding the right angle in. And for me, finding the right angle in is often a process of moving the most dramatic event off to the side of the story somewhere, putting it in the margins. A lot of my stories are aftermath stories, for instance. Like the most dramatic thing has already happened, right? Or is already in the process of happening. And so what we're looking at is not a character kind of walking into an explosion, but what happens in the wake of that explosion. And that's where I find a lot of human interest. That's where I think people get to be themselves again and get to be interesting and unpredictable. Because when you focus, there's one kind of story where that is all about the most dramatic thing. And the most dramatic thing is interesting, plot-wise, event-wise. But a character can be subsumed by that thing. A character can become less of themselves because of that explosive thing. In the worst case scenario, a character can become merely a victim of that dramatic thing, right? And I kind of, because of my interest in character, I kind of want to always find ways to focus on the characters. So whether the dramatic thing is a traumatic event, whether the dramatic thing is some sort of systemic injustice, right? I kind of want the shadow of that to be in the story, but I want the characters themselves to always be at the center.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, just hearing you talk about those things, I'm like thinking about some of the connections in the stories. Like something that's just coming to my mind right now is the stories Bystander and the title story Witness, and kind of thinking about the ways you're playing with like the idea of witnessing in different ways. Like in Bystander, you have a mother who's kind of anxious about this moment in her daughter's life, who's struggling with kind of disordered eating, but also the mother kind of has a lot of anxiety about like a home and like what home means and kind of the life she expects for herself. And in that story, without giving everything away, I feel like one of the key tensions that is so interesting that you do is that the mother kind of perceives herself and how she kind of has all these expectations about what life should be, and she's kind of uncomfortable in these different moments of like seeing what she's doing, and Witness, you almost have the reverse where the the narrator is so engrossed in the story that they've constructed for themselves, and then you have this and the memories that they've constructed, and then you have these great moments where their cousin, who they're very close with, kind of points out that's not how it happened. And I love that because you don't. I think there's a lot of restraint in that story because a lot of other stories might give you the other side, but instead you just kind of have that tension of like pointing to the reader. This is a unreliable narrator, and it adds so much. There's not really a question there. That's all to say, Jamel. Like, there's so many interesting things that you kind of remix this theme on throughout all the stories, and it leaves you really thinking after each one, I'd say.
Yeah, I was a little worried when I realized that this could be a collection or that I was building a collection because unlike with A Lucky Man, I kind of knew that this was going to be built around the idea of witness. And my fear is always that, okay, is that too limiting? Is that too narrow? Am I going to just sort of write the same story over and over again? I'm just sort of writing to a topic, which feels, yeah, I'm just a little uncomfortable with that. But what I realized was that there are so many facets to the idea of witness, right? There's so many ways of going at it, so many angles, especially when you bring in the question of acting, right? Which is why that James Baldwin epigraph is so dear to me. That it's no, this is a capacious question. So this can hold the collection together, but also give it room to breathe, right? And so that question, that story that you're talking about with the unreliable narrator, like that's central to the idea of witnessing, the reliability of the witness, right? You hear this in like court cases all the time. Like the eyewitnesses might be the least reliable person to talk to. So yeah, that question of reliability is something that I definitely wanted to play with in that story, while fixing the story as closely as possible to that narrator's version of things, right? It's sort of a delicate act. Like just sort of put these little tiny cracks in the story while maintaining the integrity of the story.
You're talking about, I think like trying to make sure that you're staying as expansive as possible while, being close to the theme. I think one of the things that stands out to me about every single one of your stories, and Phil and I have been talking about this, is the endings. The endings are so good at, I think, oftentimes, I fall into this trap all the time, endings can feel like, well, here we're trying to wrap up as neatly as we can. Here's everything that you just read, and here's what you should like come away feeling. And I think what your endings are so good at doing as wrapping things up in a way that like leave you with so much to chew on and so much to think about, and the story never feels like it's the story is ending, but the story that is being told always feels like it is going on beyond the page. And maybe you can talk about like how you write endings like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. That's the kind of ending that I love. Or that's one kind of ending I love, I should say. And I had a writing teacher who talked about the ending of a story as a gift to the reader. Like you hand the story over to the reader at that point, and it's out of your hands. And you've given them a thing that's alive, a thing that they have to attend to, a thing that's going to make demands of them, but it doesn't belong to you anymore, right? And so that kind of selflessness of an ending is something that I try to aim for sure. And I do love the idea of having the feeling that the characters are still living and breathing once the story ends. They've sort of walked off of page 19, and theoretically they could be on page 20, and we'd see more of their lives, right? But the shape of this particular part of their lives that we've been telling is complete. We've completed that shape. So I guess to talk about how I think about endings. I don't necessarily want them to be like the trumpets are blaring, that kind of artificial, the voice changes, it becomes, a lot more lyrical artificially. So although lyricism can be great in an ending, I kind of want, to me, it's about the completion of a shape. It really is. An ending is a part of a story. It doesn't exist in isolation. right? You can't talk about an ending without talking about all the other things in the story. So for me, it's about, um, have I pulled all the threads forward sufficient? Did I drop any thread that's crucial to this story? Have I pulled it all the way through from page 1 to page 18, right? Or another way of putting that is, any story kind of gathers a set of notes at the beginning of the story. And you ask yourself, well, am I sounding all those notes? Is there like a choral feeling at the end of a story, right? That all the story's important notes have been sounded. So for me, I don't know. I guess we could talk about it with specific stories, but I always think about it. I never think about an ending in isolation. I think that's the key. I think that's crucial. You can't just, when I'm teaching, for instance, sometimes when we're workshopping someone's work, someone will say, well, we have to talk about the ending. We'll start there, but inevitably we'll end up going back to page 8 or page 12 or some other place in the story. And actually, the problem with the ending is often not what's on the last page. The problem with the ending is something that wasn't fully developed or wasn't carried through halfway through the story. So as long as you have this sense that an ending is it's a point of emphasis in a story, but it doesn't sit alone. You can't detach it, right? It's intimately connected with the rest of it. And I think just remembering that can help a lot with writing a good ending.
No, that's great. You know, something I was thinking about with Witness in comparison to A Lucky Man, and maybe this speaks to what you're saying about how like the stories in A Lucky Man started kind of as a lot of like MFA's stories do, where you kind of just write a bunch and then, I think you had said in an interview, like people told you like, oh, you have a book here. And you're like, oh, wait, I do. And Witness, I know, you were coming at it with a kind of more clear idea of what you wanted to explore. I feel like it definitely, there was a lot of surprises. I guess I was expecting, I easily could have seen another collection that was very grounded in the same sense that A Lucky Man is. But I feel like there's so many surprising choices in this one, like in the story Arrows, which is kind of like a ghost story. And I think, expectations, etc. But like I wouldn't have expected there to be like a ghost in a Jamel Brinkley story, and the way that it appears, to the point where I actually kind of reread the first couple pages a couple times because I was like, wait, am I not getting it? And I wonder if maybe you could just if you could just talk about like maybe talk about Arrows, like where did that story come from? Because it seems like you're having so much fun, I think, kind of exploring way different topics in this collection.
Yeah, it is fun. Actually, it might interest you to know that that's the oldest story in the collection. The first draft of that was written 10 years ago.
Whoa.
Yeah. It just ended up in a drawer, because I wasn't sure how to address its problems. But one of its problems is that it was coy about whether or not the mother was a ghost. It was, it was kind of like, ooh, like, is she a ghost? Maybe, just being kind of silly with it. And, what I realized is that, no, she's a ghost. Just claim it. Just own it. Just own that she's a ghost. Because then that frees the story to actually explore the reasons why she's a ghost, right? Why have a ghost in the story, as opposed to having readers focus on the question of, is she or isn't she? Just get that out of the way, and then the story can focus on its real things. And so the things I was actually interested in, that I think a ghost helped me to facilitate, were, I'm always interested in time. And I think a ghost is a condensation of time, the past specifically. And I like having a figure for the past. One of my favorite academic books that I read when I was back when I was a failed PhD student, is this book called Ghostly Matters by Avery Gordon.
Okay.
And in it, she calls a ghost a seething presence, which I love. That a ghost is not something that's gone. It's actually present, right? Or the shape of it is present. and it's seething, that sense of something seething. Um, and I kind of wanted that. I wanted that kind of seethingness of time, that seethingness of the past. Um, Not only in terms of the mother figure, but in terms of the narrator who also will be a ghost, right? Because really the story is about the narrator's resentment. The story is about the narrator's ability or inability to forgive. And I think a ghost in a haunted house, that house is haunted particularly for him, right? For the narrator. More than anyone else, more than any prospective buyer of the house, more than anyone else, it's haunted for the narrator. And so to get to these ideas of the past as being actually present and seething, these ideas of a place that can be haunted by all your associations with it, by all the memories you have there. And then the question of when you have been wronged or you feel you've been wronged, can you forgive? I
Hmm.
felt like having a ghost story was a nice way to get to these real things that I wanted the story to explore.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I really loved it, and I mean that story again. Like thinking of endings, like before you hopped on, Ben and I were talking about that whole endings thing with your stories, and it kind of feels to me like if it's a film, we're seeing this moment, and then the camera just kind of pans away, and we know there's still stuff happening off screen with the father and the boy kind of walking along the shoreline, but we don't get to see it. And that tension worked so well.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me, that's another thing that I could maybe say about endings that might be interesting or useful. Like with fiction, of course, you can manipulate time in interesting ways. And I think that maybe that one of the first short story writers I saw play with time in this way was Laurie Moore.
Hmm.
Um, she'll do these flash forwards, like near the endings of her stories, and then kind of come back to the story. And that's kind of a thing that I wanted to do with this one because it could have ended with just, you know, they're getting to their destination when they're in the car, right? But to me, that wasn't the important thing. That's another question you have to ask about an ending. Like, are we landing at really the most important thing? That this plot point that they just go to their destination? No, there's something else. And so that's why I tell you that they go. We know that they're going to go. And then temporarily, I move the story back a bit. But on the way, they do this. And by focusing on this little scene on the way, I think we get to what the story is really about. You know,
Hmm.
the story begins with the figure of the mother who could be read as somewhat frightening, and a ghost figure. But what we get at the end of the story, I think, or I hope, is that the narrator is actually the frightening figure, right? That the narrator is sort of the terror of the story, the thing that people should be scared of. Um, but you have to do some temporal play in order to have the story land there.
Hmm. Uh, One of the things I want to get you to talk about is I feel like so often your characters feel like they have real presence, and you write bodies like specifically really well. Like people move through the world and impact the world around them, and I think I was noticing it so much because I was just realizing how often um, people movement in a lot of stories can feel like it's just like blocking a scene out, but it doesn't feel like it has like weight and presence,
Yeah.
and that weight feels really like it's here. And yeah, how do you approach that, or how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I guess I think about that in a couple of ways. One might have to do with the way that I think of scene or place or setting. And I absolutely don't think of it as background. It's not like a cardboard cutout on a stage. It sets the whole world of feeling. That's a phrase from Eudora Welty. It sets the entire world of feeling of the story if you really pay enough attention to it. Um, Another thing Welty says in this essay that I love, she talks about how place is somehow one of the lesser angels of fiction. Like we pay less attention to it. It doesn't seem like one of the major, like, the headline features of a story. But actually, in order for a character to seem real and likely, the place has to be even more likely, because it's place that sets the characters to scale, you know? And I love that idea that if your sense of place is thin, then the characters can become outsized or kind of gaseous or, something, right? But if you really attend to place in a firm way, then the characters firm up too. So I think a lot about that, and that's why I try to give a lot of attention to setting and place, not as the background part of a story, but as something that the characters are interacting with or being affected by, you know? The other thing I would say is the proximity between characters, you know? I taught a class on intimacy a couple years ago, and one writer we were looking at defined intimacy as the space in between, right? And I kind of love that, because it forces you as a writer to think about bodies in proximity, bodies exchanging energy, how close or far they are. I remember there was a guy who visited my MFA program when I was a student, and he said, if you get stuck in a scene, just have two characters touch each other. Things will start happening again, which is funny and kind of a delight to think about, or potentially frightening, who knows? But that idea again of bodies in proximity, of people and characters in proximity. So between always thinking about characters in terms of their proximity to other characters, is also this idea of characters in terms of how they're occupying or being affected by space, setting, which is also active in a story.
Yeah. It kept coming up even in moments where characters are thinking about things that have happened. There's a moment in one of the stories where he's imagining I think it's his father, and the different kinds of crying that his father sometimes does, and he's thinking about like the way that takes up space, and how it, like, that sound impacts him. And I was like, wow, even here I'm like feeling the presence of the room that we're in.
Yeah. I think you can't forget about it. I mean, especially I think for a writer like me, it's a risk, because I am interested in the interiority of characters. I'm interested in their way of thinking. I'm interested in their feelings. And so there's a way in which the sentence making can start to focus on that, right? This whole internal world. But one of the risks of doing that, if you're not careful, is that the external world kind of disappears, right? And I always try to keep both in mind at the same time. And remember that you don't actually have interiority unless there's an exterior too. That they're relational. Interiority doesn't exist by itself. It's in relation to something, right? And so that's when stuff becomes interesting, when that interior world is being juxtaposed to what's actually going on in the room, in the space. And so I always try to keep my eye on both.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you're saying, especially in relation to setting, is really interesting. And I think if anybody's read an interview with you, I think everybody asks you the writing about New York question, and it's hard to not ask it. And I think if I were to maybe remix it and not ask like why do you write about New York or whatnot, something that I think so much of this conversation is revolving around is, as you're saying, like time. How like Christina Sharp says in The Wake, like the past that is not the past always comes up to rupture the present. Like that whole idea, I think, is so true in your work. And when I was reading Witness, I couldn't help but think about this other novel I read recently called Didn't Nobody Give a Shit What Happened to Carlotta by James Hanahan. And that novel follows a Black trans woman who gets out of prison and kind of is trying to restart her life in New York. And you get these so much tension around returning to a place that you knew really well and it's different, and kind of working through memory and past and how it still exists. And so much of these stories are about that. So that's all to say, if I were to ask you about how you feel about writing about New York now, like, what does it feel like for you writing about this place that obviously holds so much meaning to you while not living there anymore and having all these experiences like in Iowa and California, etc.? Like, how are you viewing it now?
Yeah, I guess I would respond in a couple of ways. On a basic level, I feel like New York is still the landscape of my imagination.
Hmm.
When I think about story or the kinds of elements that communicate to me that a story might be possible, they're pretty much always rooted in New York. Um, and so New York is still a place of fascination for me, I guess.
Yeah.
Even if the New York that I know best is a New York that doesn't exist anymore, it feels like New York is still, it's both a place I know and a place that I wonder about and have questions about. So that's important. The other thing I would say is I think it's kind of, I like having, it's good to have a project where you know what some of your challenges are. So I think with because I write about New York so often, I know that one of the risks is a kind of nostalgia, right? And it's kind of a check. I think it helps to keep me honest to know that, because I'm like, well, you can't, yeah, like, dude, it's not 2005 anymore, New York is a different place. And so I don't want that wash of nostalgia to get in the way of the work or to make the work dishonest. And so it's good for me to know that, yes, I still want to write about this place, but there are risks here, there are dangers here, right? It keeps me alert, and I think that's exciting as a writer to be alert. As I'm talking, you know what just occurred to me? I, the first story in the collection, Blessed Deliverance, the starting point one of the starting points for that story was actually not in New York. It was in Oakland. I was living in Oakland, and downstairs, sort of on the corner of the apartment building where I lived, there opened up this strange, like, rabbit shelter. It was so bizarre. It was super odd. And I would kind of peek in there, and the people who worked there seemed strange to me. And I was brave enough to go in one day, but it weirded me out being in there. And so I was like, man, this is a weird place. And I never really saw anyone in there. Like, no one was in there other than the workers. Maybe I missed them. Maybe there was like a rush hour of patrons that I just never saw. But I was like, man, this place is in Oakland and nobody goes in here. It's so out of place. It just felt weird, and it fascinated me.
And when you say like, what are we? Is it like a dog pound but for rabbits?
Yeah, it was it was mostly rabbits, but I think there were also like chinchillas or other things. And yeah, it was yeah. It was like where you could go to adopt rabbits, I guess.
Who is that for?
I have no idea. I had no idea. It was very odd. But it kind of, I mean, obviously gentrification is an issue in lots of places, especially in the Bay Area. But it immediately made me think about New York, and some of the weird stuff I've seen in Brooklyn. And I was like, yeah, I know this part is from Oakland technically, but the feelings it conjures up are still New York feelings. So I put it in New York. Yeah.
Now that reminds me of Andre Asselman has an essay called Shadow Cities, which is more about an immigrant experience, but essentially about like how we try to find when we move to a new place, we often try to find shadows of the place we once were, and kind of recreate that, and kind of seeing that reflected back in a new place. I feel like it probably does come up in these kind of unexpected ways that you almost forget, like how you just remembered that.
Totally. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because that story is such a Brooklyn story to me, but I have to remind myself that actually I was thinking a lot about this place in Oakland. Yeah.
Can I ask you how it is living in Iowa, and how or if Iowa makes its way into your writing? Do you find it anywhere?
No, it hasn't. And I don't know if it's just that way, like it's just not speaking to me in that way. Obviously, there's lots of fiction that's been written in Iowa, Iowa City in particular. So it does speak to some writers, and it hasn't spoken to me. And I wonder if that's true, or if I'm like deliberately resisting it in some way,
You're like,
to
no.
kind of like plant my New York flag. Like, no, this place would never speak to me. Um, we'll see. Maybe there's an Iowa story that will emerge many years from now. But how is it living there? It's really conducive to work.
Hmm.
To reading and writing, it's really conducive to those things, which I discovered when I was a graduate student there. I was a little worried going in. I was like, I don't know if I can do this, being away from the rhythms and the flavors that kind of textured my imagination and my prose. But it wasn't a problem, and I got a lot done, and I had a good experience. And so being back, I feel like I have a really rich reading and writing life.
Hmm.
Um, and my teaching contributes to that too. You're always, with these really talented writers who are trying things, and everyone's so different from each other, and they are very challenging in a good sense, meaning, I have to kind of really bend myself to their work. And so I feel like, I don't know, I think the combination of teaching there and doing all my most of my reading and writing there has been fruitful. I do still think my life is a little unbalanced, like my family's in New York. My oldest friend, the vast majority of my oldest friends are in New York. And
Hmm.
so I still feel like I'm tilted in that direction. And so I do go back and visit a lot. But in terms of reading and writing, it's been really good for me.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Do you mind talking about who you're reading right now, and what are the kinds of writing that is drawing you in?
Yeah, it's a good question. I let's see, who have I been reading? Um I perpetually reread like Edward P. Jones, who was mentioned earlier, especially his story collections. I love Lost in the City, especially as a collection.
Mhm.
Although I think my favorite EPJ story is in All on Hagar's Children. Old Boys, Old Girls is a story I is very dear to me. So I'm constantly rereading that, his stories. Um, I've been reading a lot of Natalia Ginsburg and uh, Shirley Hazard lately. Just like just eating up their books,
Mhm.
which are really interesting. Um, the Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazard is sort of mind-boggling as a project. It's just like an incredible novel. Um, Sort of scary. Like, how did she do this? I know it took her a long time, but that's quite a feat. That book. Um, what else have I been reading? Uh, I just picked up this book, Francisco. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
By
Mm-mm.
Allison Mills Newman. I think it was recently reissued. Saidiya Hartman wrote an intro for it.
Oh, okay.
Um, Super interesting so far. Um, it's a thin book. I would recommend it. I think I might teach it at some point, but New Directions put it out. So I've been reading that, which is really good. You see me looking back at stuff. Uh, Another book I reread recently is Angels by Dennis Johnson, his first
Hmm.
novel. which I feel like a lot of people don't talk about. They talk about his later novels and, of course, about Jesus' Son. But Angels is pretty terrific, although it's brutal. It's like a brutal book. You gotta like be prepared for everything that can go wrong in an American life. Kind of goes wrong in this book. But man, the prose is gorgeous. The kind of instinctive, poetic movements from chapter to chapter. It's not like a it's not what I would call a book that has a firm architecture. It's not like, he doesn't think about, I don't think he was thinking about the novel in that way. It just has these poetic leaps and associations that are super interesting. Um,
Hmm.
let's see. Yeah, I don't know. Those are just a few that come to mind.
I feel like you
Yeah.
gave us plenty to work with.
Okay, okay.
Something that I'd love to ask you about is, so when I initially read A Lucky Man way back, I was really inspired by the story Everything the Mouth Eats. It's like a story that I continued to go back to and was really helpful for me in my master's and my MFA, and partially because I felt like I felt seen in a lot of senses in terms of like my own relationship to my older brother. And something I appreciate in Witness is, in stories like the titular story Witness, and even in the story That Particular Sunday, there's such a attention and care to how you construct these sibling or like close, almost sibling relationships in your stories. And I was just curious, like, do you have siblings, and like, do you does that, could you just talk a little bit about that, or how you think about those kinds of relationships in your work?
Yeah, I do. I have a younger brother. Um, so I do think about sibling relationships
Mm-hmm.
a lot. You can, I don't know, you're sort of cast as you will be bonded, you will be close, you already have a lot in common. So you sort of will walk this journey of life together.
Yeah.
You'll probably have some age proximity, and so it feels like your sibling feels like on some level one of your given companions in life. And so often this is not the case.
Yeah.
People are so different, and there can be something about that proximity can cause friction, or conflict, sometimes irreconcilable conflict. I'm just sort of fascinated by that, by that almost kind of forced proximity of
Hmm.
sibling relationships, at least for a time in your life, right? And what that can do, like what issues out of that, even as you're adults and maybe you don't live anywhere near each other, but like, what's the result of having had this close relationship with someone that you may or may not even like,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And, are there, does it condition your relationship seeking such that, you know, like this is sort of your testing ground for forming friendships, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing? Or is there in your life actually some kind of bitterness or some kind of bad feeling that can kind of shape your relationships too? And so I'm just sort of fascinated by different kinds of sibling or sibling-like relationships. You mentioned That Particular Sunday. I think one thing that always comes up with um, my brother and me is just this remembering things differently.
Yeah.
We had the same experience in the sense that we were both there at the same time, but it meant something entirely different to us. Or we remember what someone said different. That's not what she said. That's not what happened. And some of that is just the whims of memory, and some of it is that no, I that affected me differently. So what you're saying is not recognizable to me, and so I think sibling relationships are also an interesting way to explore the past and to explore time. Um, within a family, that relationship in particular seems super interesting to me. Yeah, and I continue to ask questions. I have no insights whatsoever, but it just continues to be fascinating to me, and so I write about it.
I really love that because my siblings and I are getting to be the age where you start to, I think, compare notes and you're like, yeah, you remember this? And so often it will be the case that someone will be like, here's this very impactful moment to me. And I'll be like, I have no memory of that at all.
Yeah,
Like, I still don't even, are you sure that happened? And they're like, what are
right.
you talking about? Like, this is like foundational to me.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, it is often a lesson and just like you would expect that because we have these so many kind of shared moments growing up, that you would be close or you would have the same experiences, but it's like you can have the identical experiences and still come away with very different POVs on them.
totally. Yeah, and that one that you're talking about in particular is so mind-boggling when someone can be like, "This is the most crucial day of my life," and your sibling is like, "I don't even remember that day at all. Was it a day? Who knows? I think you're making this up." That's so crazy. It's so
Yo.
that can happen.
Yeah, I have two younger twin sisters, and that's
Oh wow,
so it's
twins.
like it'll be both of them, or it'll be like one will be this happened, and then the other two of us will be like what, and so it's like it's just such a crazy lesson, and just like oh yeah, it's not one to one.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Um, one of my favorite stories of the collection is the Let Out, and I think it's doing something similar to exactly what we're talking about here, which is like kind of go plumbing through the depths of memory. It's a great setup, which is a son meets one of his dad's kind of ex-lovers, who is in some ways trying to relive her relationship with his father and like try to understand, where is he now? What's happening? There's a little bit of this weird tension where it's like, is the son about to make things happen with this late, and so, but it's also just, I think, about memory and trying to come back to these things, and it felt so much like one of these unrequited love stories but from a different perspective. I think like so often we get the like a Before Sunrise or I just recently watched like Past Lives, where it's like people coming back to these moments and trying to like pull apart what was there here, but this coming from this the son just felt like really rich. And maybe you
Yeah.
can talk to me about that, how you came into that.
Yeah, I was so two things went into that story. I was trying to talk back to a story that I loved. Um, One of my teachers likes to say that it's a good way to generate stories, to speak back to a story that you love or that you're just wondering about all the time.
Mhm.
She writes a lot about, or she writes back to a lot of William Trevor stories. So in this case, I was writing back to a story by a writer named Gina Berrio. And I believe the name of the story I had in mind is called The Mistress. And the setting is completely different, and that story is from the perspective of the mistress. But I wondered about the son
Mm.
figure, and I wanted to inhabit the son because I feel like the other side of that, like, even if you don't know what's going on as a kid, even if there's no tangible evidence, there's just an atmosphere in the air that things are happening in your household, right? And you may never find out what that thing was, but sometimes you do. And that can be a really strange feeling to find out what was casting that shadow over our house, our apartment, whatever, our household. So that was one thing. The other thing is I kind of wanted to, when I lived in Brooklyn, I would often go, especially during the summer, to the Brooklyn Museum,
Mm.
for what they called First Saturday. And for me, the magic of First Saturday in Brooklyn was that it's like a fictional magic. Anything could happen. Like you could encounter anyone. And I often had that experience of sort of bumping into people. Thousands of people would go to this thing from all over New York, not just Brooklyn. And you know, more than a few times, I had the experience of bumping into someone I hadn't seen in years
Hmm.
there, just because it was there, just because it's the sort of place that draws people. And so I kind of wanted to tap into that magic of encounter, right? Um, Seeing someone you haven't seen, and talking to them or not talking to them. Seeing someone who's associated with someone that that happened a lot too. Like, oh, that's such and such's friend or whatever, such and such's daughter. So I kind of wanted to tap into that magic. But then, once I kind of had that as my starting point, kind of detached myself from the burial story, I wanted to explore, yes, this boundary between desire and curiosity,
Hmm.
right? I also wanted to explore this idea of someone who is not used to being looked at
Mm.
or feels like he's not often looked at and then is. And then what do you do? Like, are you your more authentic self? Are you a performative self? Like, what happens when all of a sudden you're getting attention that you're not used to having? Like the first paragraph of that story, you don't know it's a first person story until the last word of that paragraph, right? So that kind of disguise of I'm not here, oh, I am here. Someone's actually looking at me. Someone's kind of called me out from the crowd. I wanted to explore that. And then setting it in a museum, I think was important to me because I kind of wanted to, especially like, an event like First Saturday, because you have this sort of multi art form setting in which these two characters can kind of circle each other. So the dancing, where the narrator feels comfortable for a while, but then all
Mhm.
of a sudden he's made uncomfortable because she changes up the whole vibe. And then the photography, the art, the visual art, I think was important as well. And I like the idea in terms of shaping the story, having the entrance and the exit from the space mark the shape of the story as well. That everything that was going to happen is going to happen, as we start to enter this place. By the time we leave, everything's different, and I like that idea as well.
Yeah, and I love the museum setting because again, he goes from a person who's like I'm anonymous in some ways to
Yes,
here's a person who knows way more than they should about me and is
yes,
very familiar with my family and the family dynamics and is reciting those back to me in a way that is like profoundly uncomfortable, um, but was just like great. It was just great.
yeah, yeah. Good. Oh, thanks. I'm glad you like that one.
Mm. I have a kind of maybe selfish question to ask, but I was curious, like, you, in the same vein as a lot of Edward P. Jones stories, I'd say, like, you write a bit of a longer story. And I think that, both of you are kind of excel at really capitalizing on digression and how, like, the whatever you think the main plot line is, it doesn't have to be that for the entire story. And in fact, if you kind of go off somewhere else, maybe something interesting will happen. Um, and that's something that I'm really interested in my own work. But something that I've found I struggle with, and this isn't about the actual act of writing, but getting the writing out there is just like it seems like nobody wants a long short story. And like how do you grapple with that? Do you think about like the length that you're writing at, or do you think about those kinds of things, or do you think more about like the book and not worry so much about getting it somewhere?
I've been made to think about it a few times. Like sometimes an opportunity will emerge and my agent will say, "Yeah, but you have to cut 1,000 words out of the story." And I was like, "What? Like, how is that possible? What are you talking about? That's crazy. You just massacred the story." Um, and yes, but usually I try not to think about it. My colleague at Iowa says that she feels like most story writers have a length that is more or less natural to them. Doesn't mean that you always end up on the exact same page, obviously, but that you're kind of in this range.
Hmm.
Some people write long, some people write really short, some people write like 8-page stories, and that's their thing. I'm not that person. um, so I think you have to accept that about yourself. I mean, of course, you can push your limits and try to write different kinds of stories. I would encourage that. That's great. Flex those muscles, but if that's where you naturally gravitate, then that's a beautiful thing, and just kind of accept that. As far as placing the stories and length, it is an issue, you know. I mean, it seems my sense, you know, coming out with this collection and trying to place stories from this collection is that it seems like things are more and more online now, even
Mhm.
more so than when A Lucky Man came out. And so my hope is that that would mean a long story is less of an issue. Um, but you're right. I mean, some places just they won't look at it. They won't look at the work. I will say though, I think if this may not be true, but my sense is that if you have a collection, if you do focus on the book, you have a collection, and that's making its way into the world. I think just the fact that the individual stories you're trying to place are part of a collection will make them more appealing to editors. You know,
Mm.
and they may be able to kind of give you a pass on the
Mhm.
story length a little bit more than they might. But yeah, it's unfortunately I feel like it shouldn't be an issue. I sort of understand why it's an issue, but I wish I didn't make people who write long stories feel bad, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Well, Ben, do you have things that we missed anything? I just feel like Jamel, I mean, everything you've told us today is just I'm left here thinking about so much. I'm curious if there's anything maybe that we haven't asked you yet that you feel like, damn, why didn't these two ask me about this? Or um, is there anything we're missing?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm always interested to see where any conversation will go. And I'm sort of excited when I'm hitting the same points over and over again. So yeah, I've been happy with this conversation. I don't know if you have any last questions, but there's nothing that I feel like you're not asking me. That's a glaring omission.
Well, I guess here's one. Just right off the press. When are we getting the Jamel fantasy sci-fi short story? When are we getting the speculative fiction?
I don't know. It could happen, you know, like if it, I mean, I'm a fan of that stuff, especially, I mean, I used to read it a bunch when I was a kid. Um, and I'm a big fan of the films and TV shows. I totally indulge in sci-fi fantasy. To me, I think it's, and you know, I read it a lot because of my work. You know, it comes up in workshop, and I have to think
Mhm,
about it, and so it's interesting to me. I'm not a realism snob at
mhm.
all, although that's mostly my mode. Realism in its most capacious sense. Um, I think that if it helps to facilitate something that I'm thinking about, I probably wouldn't hesitate to do it. You know, in the way that I was talking about the ghost story as a way to get to something.
Hmm.
Yeah.
um, it opens up, you know, space for a story to explore. It could totally happen. I don't know when, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like the story Sahar is pretty close to being like a sci-fi story in the sense of like I wouldn't have expected to get this kind of gig work, Uber kind of connection appearing in one of your stories, and that ended up being like one of my favorites because it's not really one that I've seen something similar to before, and I loved how it kind of became almost this epistolary adjacent kind of thing that really worked. And yeah, it was just it's a surprising and interesting story.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I had fun writing that one. It was different. It was different for me, but I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Yeah, I don't have any questions left. I thank you.
Thank you for
Yeah.
having me. This has been great. A lot of fun.
And that was our conversation with Jamel Brinkley about his new short story collection called Witness. Yeah, I feel just like excited to talk about talking to Jamel because this is somebody that I've really looked up to for so long, and he didn't disappoint. I have to say.
Yeah, I also I feel bad, but also it was like great from like my perspective that it, in so many ways, kind of felt like a small seminar. Like, I feel like he was great about giving. He was like, "Oh, here's a little thing that you should be trying in your writing," or like, "Here's how you should be thinking about like setting up the scene." I was like, "Yeah, cool. I'm just writing all this down. Good to go."
Yeah, he was very good at like breaking down his stories, and kind of really wasn't afraid or shy about like talking about the mechanics that went into making them, and like his thought process into making them. It didn't feel like he was trying to make it like a magic trick, you know, like he's going to reveal to you a little bit about how he came to creating the work. And you know, I think especially for writers, that was really great to hear, and kind of hear a little bit about his thought process.
Yeah, you know, the thing that has stuck with me, we interviewed him a couple days ago now, is the idea, and he kind of talked about it, that like short stories are closer to life and closer to memory, just in terms of like how we move through the world, that things don't wrap up, and that a good short story and a good short story ending, you know, carry through all the themes and the threads and the idea that capture this like moment in a person's life, a snapshot, and then you're able to kind of move on. But knowing that like things are kind of not resolved. And I was thinking about this in the context of, you and I have this conversation a lot, and I can't remember, this might have been you or this might have been me, but banging this drum about, we both read a lot of nonfiction essay collections, and so often those feel like they fall down because they try to wrap things up and give you a sense of completion by the time you've gotten to the end of an essay collection. And at the end of those, you know, inevitably I'll you know, message you in the chat or we'll talk, and I'll be like, no, it didn't work for me, because it feels like it's trying to end and feel like it's a novel, but like real life just doesn't work that way. Like there's no things, the threads don't all come together and then like you get a nice conclusion and then you move on. Like that's just not how things work. And so I think him talking about how short stories in some ways like are able to capture that feeling where this is a moment, we can embody the moment, but then, you know, things are going to keep going and keep unspooling. I really, really resonated with that.
Yeah, I mean, his point about endings are just a part of the story, you know, like I think I definitely fall into the trap a lot of times when I'm like in the first couple drafts of a story where I just want to tie up the thing with a bow at the end, and like here's kind of like the thematic resonant, and he even pokes fun at the lyrical final paragraph that blows everything open, and you feel amazing afterwards. I think his point about like in the workshops he teaches, he's found that yes, the ending is important and you know, needs to mean something. Ultimately, what conversations end up going back to is like something on page 8, I think he said, like, you know, something in the middle of the story that is reflecting back to the ending. And I think that's something to really to grab hold of, because yeah, I mean, I think with nonfiction collections, so often, you know, because a lot of them are pretty like personal essay memoiristic approaches, like it kind of feels like every single essay has to be building to the next one, you know. And I think like Witness is a good reminder of like taking this kind of pretty broad theme around witness and perceiving, and how you can really do so much with it. Like, I mean, I wasn't just gassing him up when I said I was really surprised with this collection to see like a ghost story and to see like a Uber, you know, gig worker kind of story. Like it felt like he was really able to spread out a lot more than even in A Lucky Man.
Yeah. The endings are just so good. I almost feel like, Phil, do you have the book on hand? I almost feel like we should like grab one of the endings just so people have like a context of like, hey, these things are really good.
Yeah, I have the book here. So, you know, just for readers, you know, this story, Arrows, follows a narrator who is in his parents' home. His mother has passed away and been gone, at least for a little while. He is a single father who has his son for the weekend. and his father still lives in the house, but he's blind. And the story is kind of looking at this tension and this haunting that exists in this house for the narrator, and kind of how he's able to see his mother still as an actual ghost that is kind of a ominous presence in the house. And I'm pretty sure in the conversation we talk about it, and Jamel does a better job than I could at explaining the story. But at the very end of the story, his father is going to be transferred to like a retirement home, kind of assisted living situation, and they have driven out to that assisted living situation. But the story kind of flashes back to a moment on the drive out, which is a really interesting kind of choice that Brinkley makes. And I'll just read this final paragraph. It's a little bit on the longer side, but we'll get through it. The detour had come toward the end of the drive. I took an impromptu right turn and proceeded in that direction until we reached the parking lot of a train station by the lower Hudson. Pops and Zahir were confused as I urged them out of the car. On the other side of the station, after you descend a long staircase to the platform for southbound trains, there is a place I knew, where you could have a special experience of the ever-changing river. I led my son and my father down to that place. From there, where today the river appeared swollen from the rain, we could taste the faint, bracing stench of the leaden water. We could feel on our skin the flexing of this arm of the sea, and hear in the spring breezes the heavy admonition of its rush. This was a place where you had a chance to unburden yourself, where your concerns might be shaken off or transfigured. We stood out there for a few moments in sensory plenitude. Then Zahir took Pops by the hand to guide him down a few more steps, and then forward along the edges of the river's bank. I watched them walk parallel to the flow of the bank. For a moment, it roared south toward the harbor, in no time at all, much more quickly than you'd expect of a blind old man being tugged along by a fickle little boy. They opened a great deal of distance between us, as if they were frightened of me, as if they were taking flight. And yeah, I mean, the ending will hit more if you've read the story, but I think it's just an example of this kind of really subdued. It doesn't tell you kind of how to feel at the end, but it definitely kind of leaves you feeling something, right? And I think that whatever that something is going to be different for everybody that reads it. So
yeah, and the other thing there is that the ghost of his mother, I think in the beginning of that short story is like, I'm gonna haunt this place, because he's talking about like, I'm gonna send my dad to a retirement home and I'm gonna sell this house. I'm gonna try to move us out. And so the ghost of his mother is like, well, I'm gonna haunt this place and it's gonna make it harder to sell it. And so I think in some ways too, you can like read that ending as like a moment where everyone, like the disruptor, and I think Jamel might say this, that it's like the thing to be frightened of is maybe the main character and not the ghost after all. That the person disrupting their lives is the protagonist after all that.
It's I think especially with Witness, if you've read his previous collection, it really makes you appreciate this one so much more, because, well, I mean, there's definitely some through lines that I think we can pinpoint in Brinkley's writing. And we talk a lot about like siblings, tensions between siblings and family members, time and the friction that time and memory puts on to us in the present. I think that's another theme. But I think like the situations that he puts his characters in this particular collection compared to the first are a little bit more, obtuse and harder to square in really interesting ways. So I think it was one of those things where, when, at least for me, Ben, I don't know about you, because I really loved his first collection. When I was reading the first couple stories in Witness, I was kind of like, I mean, it's good, but I don't know if I like it as much. I think after talking to him, I mean, who knows how I feel about it yet, but I definitely have a way bigger appreciation of kind of what's happening on the page in this one now.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that really sold me is when he talked about this idea of trying to start the stories after the big thing has already happened, so that the kinds of shifts in people's lives that you're seeing are not the momentous decision, but are the thing that's like really small and really nuanced. And I think that it feels that way. And so as a reader, I think sometimes, and we talked about this, I would be like this is like, what am I reading here? Like, sometimes I think you're waiting for something that you can latch onto that's like the big moment or the big reveal or the big, whatever. But I think I ended up really liking this feeling of really subtle, small moments that are in their own way kind of momentous.
Yeah. It, I think it just gives you a lot to chew on. And I don't know, like, I do kind of want to see, like, this collection, you can see Brinkley kind of moving even further out of maybe the comfort zone of just writing kind of these very grounded literary realism stories about New York to kind of like experimenting a little bit in the same setting, but like, I don't know, I feel like there's a sci-fi story happening in the next 10 years from Brinkley.
That's what I want. That's what I just want all of the authors that we read to move towards speculative fiction. I don't think I'm asking that much.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So it was a really good conversation. I think it was pretty interesting to hear his answer about New York and like writing about New York, and because I point this out in the interview, but if you've read any conversations with him, like transcribed interviews or even podcasts, you can definitely sense this kind of friction to asking about like, hey, you write about New York, like what else though? That's kind of like what a lot of the through lines of these questions are kind of jabbing at. And I thought it was kind of interesting that, he talked about how New York is kind of the place of his imagination still. But I thought it was also interesting that he isn't really inspired by any other places he's lived yet, except for the bunnies.
Rest in peace to Iowa. Iowa may never recover.
That man said no so quickly to you asking if Iowa has inspired anything. He's like, absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Although he did cop to, he was like, maybe it's just because I am like actively resistant to the idea of Iowa making it into my writing. But you know what? That's funny too.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to say it, but I think he is a special kind of person in Iowa, and that's a writer, and we're talking to him about place, and that being a New Yorker, and like so everybody in my family but myself and my immediate family is from New York, and I'm the weird Midwestern kid. And what I have grown up with is that New Yorkers always will be like, doesn't matter, like New York is the best place. Like even if we lived, like literally I lived in Michigan for like 20 years and my parents would be like, yeah, but we're from New York, and we don't even say that we like live in Michigan, basically. Like, so I think there's probably some of that, like that. This New Yorker,
Michigan, Iowa,
like,
nobody's claiming you.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, I mean, Ben, is there anything that you wanted to talk about with this conversation that we haven't yet?
No, I just really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, the book comes out August 1st. In the US. It'll be everywhere. Definitely worth your time. And I don't like we said at the top of the conversation, it's really nice to just kind of read some stories. Like I could just close the book, read a little 20-page story or something, and these stories will really give you something to chew on. So it's not like you need to like read it all in one sitting or whatnot. So make sure to check out Witness. But with that, we will catch y'all here on the next episode of Origin Story.
Remember, you heard it here first. Short stories are back, okay?
They back, baby.
This is not a depression winter. It's a short story winter.
Short story summer. Thanks again for checking out the show. If you would like to follow me on Twitter, it is 3D Cisco on Twitter as well as Instagram. And you can follow Ben on Twitter at sad_radio_lad. We wanted to thank Melody Hirsch, who designed all the awesome cover art and design work for the website and the podcast itself. And we wanted to thank Ryan Hopper, who does all the intro and outro music, as well as some of the interstitial stuff you hear in different episodes. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left a review on iTunes, subscribed on either iTunes or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. Reviews help just get the show in front of more people, and it only takes a couple of minutes. So yeah, if you could do that for us, it'd be greatly appreciated.
You should also visit our website at www.originstory.show. It's a great place to look at all of our episodes. There are full transcripts and a link to our Discord channel where we talk with listeners about everything OS and beyond. There's a lot of posting that goes on in there, so I don't know. If you're into that, come join us. You can also email us at theoriginstorypod@gmail.com. We're always looking for feedback, whether it's ideas for games that we should play, books that we should read, guests that we should have on the show. Just hit us up with thoughts, feelings. We're always looking for feedback, even if it's that Ben has an annoying voice and you don't want to hear it anymore. I mean, that's totally fine. So write us in. You can also follow us on Twitter at @originstory_ or our Instagram at originstory.show. As always, thanks for listening.